Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Improving Our Responses to and Prevention of Homelessness Using Collaborative Outcome Planning, brought to you by the SPC, the Systems Planning Collective. My name is Lindsay McRae. I'm on the communications team at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and we're a member of the Systems Planning Collective. I'll be your moderator for today and your contact throughout the webinar if you encounter any tech-related issues. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. This is a listen-in only webinar, so if you have any issues, please use the questions box to send me a message and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. If you have any questions for the presenters, which we encourage, during the webinar, use this same questions box to post them. We'll have a question and answer session at the end and we'll do our best to get to everyone's questions then. We'll be recording the webinar and sending a link to the recording to everyone here with us today so that you can watch it at a later date or send the recording to anyone you think may be interested. The recording will also be posted on both the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness's Vimeo account and the Away Home Canada website. And with that, I'm excited to welcome our panelists for today. So welcome to David French, Director of Policy and Planning at Away Home Canada. Welcome to Keith Jones from R. Keith Jones and Associates and the CDS Network. And welcome to Dina K. Benno, Housing and Homelessness Coordinator for the City of Abbotsford. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our first panelist, David French, to get us started.
Thanks, Lindsay, and thanks everybody for joining us. If I can, I might start with a bit of an introduction to the System Planning Collective for those of you that aren't familiar with it. So the System Planning Collective is led by Away Home Canada, the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and Turner Strategies, and is dedicated to helping communities and governments to prevent and end all forms of homelessness in Canada by supporting evidence-based systems planning, capacity building, and technical assistance. We've established the System Planning Collective to enhance the quality of systems planning, ultimately with the goal of accelerating our collective progress towards ending homelessness. And this is an opportunity, this webinar is an opportunity to learn from really transformational work that we've observed in BC. And so thank you to Keith and Dina for joining us. This is we don't have all the solutions as the System Planning Collective, but we are really keen to continue to learn and dig deep on these kinds of opportunities to partner and observe really collaborative responses. Next slide, please. So fusion policy. I'm going to introduce the concepts to fusion policy and how we get to this place around collaborative outcome planning, and then Dina and Keith will take over. But governments have endeavored to move forward in this space, and there are a number of provincial and territorial governments that have examples of shared outcome planning, but truly we haven't reached a saturation level with respect to these innovations, and I really feel like we should have by now. All the examples are there. So we now have new youth homelessness data, federal point in time count data, refined HMIS work in communities. We can further articulate more comfortably and assign roles across government and where departments must be engaged in the response to homelessness. One of the most common pitfalls of our work to prevent and end homelessness is that the people we engage with in the community planning and leadership work are often a narrowly defined group. So engaging outside of a regular circle, while it can cause friction, but it also can allow for real enlightenment. We know that the causes and consequences of homelessness are complex and vary with each individual, and so therefore our solutions and how we approach the work must be more nuanced and involve the many systems and sectors that are implicated in this wicked problem. Next slide, please. Approaching fusion policy comes with particular challenges, which I'm sure Dina and Keith will speak to. But it's these examples that are most important to highlight and emphasize, not only with our governments, but also with our funders. Innovations like collaborative outcome planning at the community level gives governments important steps and examples that allow them to think differently. Especially in this sector where, in my opinion, the real innovation lives and breathes at the community level. we can cite numerous examples of successes at the community level that have resulted in real big shifts in government. Housing First and Housing First for Youth is a perfect example. The practice around those interventions wasn't birthed by government. It was community who led the work, did the heavy lifting, and created a frame for what governments can consider promising practice. And now look at Housing First and Housing First for Youth nationally. Widely accepted, common language. I believe collaborative outcome planning is no different than that. So taking that cross-systems approach to tackling the wicked problem in communities gives governments a roadmap for how they need to engage with their various cross-ministry partners. Next slide, please. It's really important to note that mandatory community level outcomes that have been put forward by Reaching Home, Canada's homelessness strategy, are really well thought out and point to the fact that the goal of reduction to chronic homelessness does not only mean working with those who are currently chronically homeless. They've introduced new mandatory outcomes, new inflows into homelessness that are reduced. This in itself is, primary and secondary prevention. And returns to homelessness are reduced. This is tertiary prevention. These are new frontiers for policy and practice. And through the course of the 10 years of Reaching Home, much will be learned about how we need to amplify the work at the community level around outcomes and around systems work. Reaching Home is also going to require designated communities to develop and implement plans that outline investments, housing placements, prevention, shelter diversion, support services across an array of a menu of services, capital investments, and coordination of resources and data collection. Communities will need to set targets for all mandatory community level outcomes and only voluntary outcomes. There's going to be voluntary outcomes that they can choose. And this is a real important signal and a space for collaborative outcome planning. And how can we teach up? How can we influence up to government about how this work needs to happen across the system and not just in the housing and homelessness sector? The work that translates here should be outcomes that we push up to also the provincial and territorial systems level. So here, the challenge and the opportunity is how can we ensure those governments are listening, engaged in the results at the community level, and see how they can improve and reshape system pathways. Over to you, Keith.
Thank you, David. That was very helpful for setting the stage for what we're about to talk to for sure. So good day, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar. My name is Keith Jones, and I'm speaking to you from Victoria, while my colleague Dina will be speaking to you from Abbotsford. Dina and I, along with our colleague Bob Yates, have been working together on homelessness and affordable housing strategies, plans, and their implementation for the past 4 years. We appreciate the opportunity to share some of our experiences and insights from this work over the next 40 minutes. And we'll try and give you a reasonable sense for the work we've been doing with the community of Abbotsford. I will start off first talking about our strategy work, and then Dina will follow talking about how we pivoted from that to implementation. We will close off by sharing you a dialogue we had with one another over the last couple of days, where we reflected on some of the key learnings and insights from this work that we felt were important to share with you. While there is much work still to be done, what has started to happen in Abbotsford is quite remarkable. Next slide, please, Lindsay. Before we get started, I'd like to make a few acknowledgements. With this kind of deeply collaborative work, and at this stage in our careers, many people that helped shape our knowledge and experiences and approaches. I have worked closely with Don Simpson since 2003. And while I was a successful consultant at that time, Don introduced me to something called the Challenge Dialogue System, or CDS. And CDS, along with an amazing group of thoughtful leaders and pathfinders globally, as part of the Innovation Expedition Network. Our strategy work also was influenced by the learnings and experience we gained while Bob Yates and I were part of the Integral Strategy Network. I should note that Bob Yates, who's not with us today, and I are close partners on this work with Abbotsford and on many other complex challenges with other clients. Because of the way in which we work with our clients and other natural allies in our network, we would be remiss not to note their contributions in helping us understand complex multi-stakeholder challenges. You'll hear from Dina shortly, but I want you to know that all of the complex challenge clients we have worked on, of all of them, Dina is the person that is most inspirational to us, especially when it comes to implementing the kind of strategies and plans we develop. In addition, through this work in Abbotsford, we have met many wonderful people in all walks of life in the community. In fact, so much so that it feels like a second home to us. We are grateful and honored that we have had this opportunity to get a close glimpse of life within this special community. Next slide, please. So, learning outcomes. We set out today 3 learning outcomes. First, I will talk about the why and how. That is, why it's important and how to put a strong collaborative outcome lens on system planning work, and showing you at least one way of doing it. The second learning objective will be addressed by Dina, where she will build on the first, moving the conversation from strategy to implementation and action. That is from a collaborative approach to mapping and planning to collective action and collective leadership, all of which is to help make progress on achieving greater collective impact. Back to the why. For the third learning outcome, as I've mentioned already, Dina and I will focus on some reflections and learning where we have asked ourselves, what are some of the key insights from this journey we have taken that we can share with you, and which of these have most led to success in the community? Next slide, please. Why and how. So on to the why and how. So again, putting a strong lens on collaborative outcome system planning. Next slide, please. As we often do in challenge dialogues, we like to first lay out and test a few assumptions. We've identified 9 over the next couple of slides. I'm sure there are many more, but these are the ones that seem to stand out to us at this point in time with this kind of work. First, we seem to be living in a world that's getting ever more complex, where systems are deeply intertwined, interdependent, and in some cases colliding. This complexity and convergence is forcing us to look at challenges and issues much more systematically and much more systemically. Unlike 20 to 30 years ago, when things seemed tidier and more orderly, the problems we are trying to face today go well beyond the boundaries of any one single organization, one mandate, beyond one sector, beyond one domain, beyond one area of expertise, beyond one culture, etc. Some people struggle to understand and embrace this pervasive complexity, which is quite understandable. But unfortunately, with this work, it can't be avoided. If we want to achieve more integrated, enduring, and sustainable solutions, we have to get into it. In our view, the front-end work in understanding the nature of systems we are attempting to change or transform just has to be done. No longer are the simplistic solutions effective. We need to dive into the wire ball, the complexity, figure things out, and understand relationships and interdependencies between the elements that make up the system. When you do, you reach to the other side of what sometimes we refer to as elegant simplicity. However, I must say, I'm not always sure necessarily it's called elegant, but it does offer a lot more clarity. With this kind of work, there's also a need to think differently, act differently, and be differently as a person and as an organization in that context. Another way of saying this is we need to align our thought, action, and presence in order to work together more effectively and efficiently towards a shared common purpose. For some systems thinking work, we also need to be more disciplined, yet also while being more adaptive. We need to be more nimble, but also more thoughtful. We need to be more broad-minded, not a narrow and shallow thinker when considering options for creating the changes we seek. Next slide, please. We often use the expression that some structure is liberating, especially when you're dealing with processes to address complexity. But as with discipline, structures need to be flexible and adaptive too. They need to be well ventilated, some would say, across the columns and between the rows. And some structures need to be temporary, whereby a task team is struck, it does its work, it celebrates, and it is disbanded. Certainly, some structures also need to be standing in nature to ensure continuity. We tend to think of collaboration as the critical DNA for infusing innovative solutions throughout our socioeconomic systems. We need to embrace innovation more fully in all its forms and not be afraid to try different things, to design trials explicitly so we can learn fast and fail fast, moving on to the next idea. These elements are often an integral part of our strategies. Relationship building in all this work is key, and it drives how we trust one another. It is often said that authentic change moves at the speed of trust. In our work, a simple process we often use is to ask people in a group to give each other a gift of trust. This concept comes from Africa. I used this recently in Vancouver at a climate adaptation workshop where a number of contentious issues were being discussed. Early on, I asked the group at the tables to look each other in the eye and give each other a gift of trust. Initially, there were some giggles, but then they looked each other in the eye and I'm assuming offered that gift. Of course, I then said, at the end of the day, everything can return back to normal. More awkward giggles, but the point had been made. I think it helped make a significant difference in the performance of the group over the course of the day. Those awkward issues that were raised in the pre-dialogue before the workshop, that is, either didn't surface again because they had been acknowledged in our pre-report or were dealt with respectfully at the workshop. Co-creation is a word you now see quite often and is joined at the hip with collaboration. When it occurs in a creative and authentic manner, its effect is powerful and the result can be quite remarkable. And co-creation naturally leads to stronger shared ownership, commitment, and often acceptance of responsibility and even accountability. It helps to change the pronouns in the conversation too. People say our, and more often our challenge, our goal, and we. There is no them. We also encourage the use of the term dialogue over the word debate, and the term alignment over the term agreement. Small changes in language can make big difference to the cultural aspects of the changes you seek. We live in a highly competitive world, and often this does not help in the need for better communication, cooperation, coordination, and collaboration, all those C words. If you find yourself faced with competitive challenges, real or perceived, you may want to ask, remind me again, what are the benefits of us not working more intentionally on a shared goal? Next slide, please. Values and principles. Collaboration is easier when people share the same values and operating principles. In our work, we honor diversity as a source of organizational strength, and our core values are many: trust, relevance, learning, integrity, inspiration, high performance, resourcefulness, resilience, collaboration, courage, creativity, passion, and fun. Now, this may seem like a lot of values, but when I think about the current work we do, all of these play out at some point over the course of an assignment. On the right-hand side of this slide are 17 operating principles that we use in our challenge dialogues. My intention was not for you to be able to read these during this presentation, but I would be happy to provide these as a resource after the webinar. Like the values, some people say, you've got too many principles. Perhaps. So we say, well, pick 3 or 4 that most speak to you. Again, with most of our work on complex multi-stakeholder challenges, there are very few projects where we don't utilize most, if not all of these at some point in the process. Next slide, please. While this webinar is focused on system planning to support the response and prevention of homelessness, it is probably of no surprise to you that many other challenge areas and sectors are also faced with increasing complexity. These are some of the projects that we've been involved in more recently. These other topics that have helped deepen our understanding of some closely related systems such as food security, community literacy, affordable housing, local immigration, and active living. But even the other more technical projects have allowed us to understand the nature of systems more generally, and the important role of things like leadership, culture, innovation, research, funding, and resources, performance measurement, and continuous measurement, just to name a few. Next slide, please. So while the challenges I just mentioned are on different subject areas, they do share some similar characteristics. For example, they all include diverse stakeholder groups, often from different sectors, and with those sectors, different cultures. Each member of a group or organizational unit, of course, has its own mandate, its own objectives, resources, and budget. But they do share a particular piece of the desired and shared long-term goal, a piece. With reference to the elephant, oh, there is no elephant in the figure, sorry. There was originally an elephant in the figure. And so imagine the elephant with different people around the parts of the elephant. It is only when you begin to unpack the complex challenge, that is the elephant overall, and work on defining the shared long-term goal, that you begin to see how the various parts make up the whole. Until then, you may see the elephant thinking rather that an ear is a fan or its trunk is a snake. These These challenges shared by multiple stakeholders and organizations can create a leadership and control challenge for the group. Some groups devise very complex governance and control systems, and is to be the case often, as is the case often in corporate alliances. In other cases, the governance is non-existent, and in some cases, just an honorable handshake does the job nicely. And all of this takes us back to trust again, which I mentioned earlier. New design work is being done on governance and oversight to support collective endeavors. The key often is to strike the right balance between setting in place some level of structure and control with ample doses of flexibility that provides groups with the freedom to go where their energies and interests take them serendipitously. Certainly, the constellation model, devised originally by Tanya Sermon, and probably others, are worth a serious look. Invariably, no matter what the challenge, there is a strong case to be made for social and economic benefits from working more intentionally and collectively, whether it be taking on the challenge of digitally transforming the mining sector or pooling government data to make it more accessible for governments, business citizens, and academia. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by collaborative outcome planning? What do we think are some of its distinctive features? From our perspective, this way of undertaking the development of strategies and plans began in the early 1990s, where the values and principles I spoke of earlier consistently led to what we felt were more effective approaches to engagement and the development, that is, co-creation, of more effective strategies and plans. With reference to the discover point, the first point, a key feature was the strong use of dialogue. We believe dialogue, when purposeful and focused around a particular challenge, is essential. Dialogue among a diverse set of participants helps us understand more deeply and clearly the full nature of the challenge we are trying to address, the assumptions we are making about the challenge as well. The dialogue helps us understand scope, what's relevant, what should be part of the conversation, and what's not relevant. In using the challenge dialogue system, we used asynchronous and face-to-face conversation. The asynchronous aspect, before we meet face-to-face, allows us to engage virtually anyone in the challenge conversation, no matter where they are, no matter what time of day. Recalling the notion that some structure is liberating, most of our collaborative outcome planning processes are laid out as a set of steps or elements, but in an integrated, often end-to-end manner. I'll be showing you some of these momentarily. These steps also have links to specific sub-processes with their own specific tools, guides, templates, checklists, and examples. We feel that the approaches we use are very collaborative, co-creative, and put a strong lens on identifying and aligning on a shared set of outcomes and the interventions that lead to these outcomes. Having a focus on outcomes is key. And once those are in place, also focusing on the interventions that will result in these outcomes. The focus on outcomes tends to be very in sync with the co-creation of strategies and action plans that are complete, comprehensive, and most importantly, coherent. And they are actionable with the addition of actions or interventions. The products are therefore implementation ready. Throughout our processes and interactions, we always seek opportunities to look for learning, action or participatory learning, and the building of capacity for those we are working with, including a distinctive mentoring approach. Next slide, please. As we reflect on our work in collaborative outcome strategy and planning, we have started to envision the processes and products we create in the form of 4 somewhat distinct processes with their associated sets of products or outputs. While we see some distinction in the 4 processes, in some situations they are applied in a sequence and may also be overlapping on some steps. So much for the tidy circles. Further, the starting point in these processes will vary depending on the stage, state, and maturity of the collective effort under consideration. This means we can be flexible in response to different situations. I should point out that we are still refining this discover, develop, implement DNA model. The discover circle is very mature and proven, having been used for hundreds of challenge dialogues over the past 25 years. It describes the 8 steps to a typical challenge dialogue. The develop circle is relatively mature and is focused on collaborative outcome mapping, where strategic intentions are translated into an explicit causal hierarchy of outcomes, outcome pathways all directly linked to a set of interventions, in aggregate forming an outcome-based actionable plan. The implementation circle draws on either or both the discover and development circles, where the focus turns to setting priorities, identifying shared measures in relation to those outcomes, mobilizing leadership and teams, and generally deepening the on-the-ground engagements of stakeholders through that strengthening of relationships at all levels. The last circle is about the DNA of collaboration and innovation. It is not so much about a set of steps, but rather a set of elements related to important principles and qualities necessary for new forms of leadership in Pathfinders and supported by a distinctive leadership mentoring model. Our work in Abbotsford has allowed us to both apply, observe, and evolve these processes. Next slide, please. Discover. Dean is going to tell you about the work in Abbotsford, but let me give you a quick walk through each of the 4 circles, starting with the discover process, which we call the challenge dialogue system, a comprehensive set of principles, processes, and tools to help diverse groups collaborate and innovate to address complex challenges. The focus of this discover process is to gain a clear understanding of the challenge at hand It's difficult to create an effective plan unless you are aligned precisely on what the key challenge is. And this is not often a short conversation and is usually iterative and evolving. The process occurs mainly online and can engage numerous participants, sometimes well over 100, to respond to the challenge paper, which is step 4 in the process. However, prior to seeking this feedback, steps 2 and 3 are focused on preparing a thorough dialogue plan, including thinking carefully about who you need to engage in the dialogue. It's interesting to note that it's not until step 6 that a workshop is held. The challenge dialogue is supported by a comprehensive CDS learning program, which includes a set of 8 modules, associated webinars, mentoring, and a rich set of tools, templates, guides, and examples. Next slide, please. Develop. The Develop circle describes the 8 steps used to co-create and begin implementing what we now call a collaborative outcome change framework. This framework is developed using outcome mapping and builds on the steps in the Discover circle. The first half of this process involves intense work by a design team of around 25 people who come together over the course of several half-day workshops to identify and help model the outcomes and interventions. The key deliverable from this process is the framework, step 6. The framework is often printed about 3 feet by 2 feet high, a large document. A key feature of this process is also the community forum following the creation of the framework. This is where the design team members invite several colleagues to both learn about and begin to apply the framework. Dina will be talking about the about the community frameworks shortly. Next slide, please. Implement. We should note that much of the inspiration to document and describe the implement circle and the next DNA circle came again from observing how Dina tended to operate with the numerous stakeholders within Abbotsford's community. It is Abbotsford's community homelessness prevention system. As one success seemed to naturally lead to another, Bob and I asked ourselves, how can we clone Dina? What's the magic sauce that brings it all together to make things work, to activate the outcomes framework? The Implement Circle defines a set of activities focused on the use of the framework to develop more detailed action plans. The plan includes setting priorities, identifying key projects, building performance measurement and reporting framework, as well as providing an ongoing guidance to all involved in the implementation activities. The activities shown are not necessarily have to be entirely in sequence, by the way. Next slide, please. The last circle is the DNA of collaboration and innovation. The DNA circle speaks to the other side of the collaborative outcome planning. It's not what you do, but how you do it. As I mentioned earlier, this circle is about how you think differently, how you act differently, and how you have a different presence. The 8 elements of the DNA circle can be used in different ways. For example, as a checklist on progress on how the collaborative effort is progressing, as a diagnostic at the start of the process to determine whether partners are ready to collaborate, or as a personal guide where you ask yourself, are you being true to the principles of collaboration? Some of the features noted in this circle relate closely to what I described earlier in regards to the values and principles of the challenge dialogue system. All 4 circles of processes and elements can work together. For example, we can often link up the discover and develop cycles to ensure that the challenge is clearly understood before the planning process starts. People may ask, where do I start in the process? The answer is, with this approach, you can start where you are at, as we mentioned earlier. If you are struggling to understand the challenge that your group is trying to address, then the Discover Circle using the challenge dialogue would be a good place to start. On the other hand, if you pretty much know what your challenge is, but you need to create a collaborative outcome plan, then the Develop Circle is where you should start. Or if you have a strategic plan in place, but need to tighten up the implementation process, then go to the Implementation Circle. Lastly, if you're just starting out and you need to see how aligned the group is at in terms of values and principles level, think consider some of the elements in the DNA circle. Dina is now going to describe the processes and activities that she has led and facilitated in Abbotsford with respect to the homelessness challenge in the community. We have structured Dina's narrative around the three processes: discover, develop, and implement. But she will be skipping over many of these steps in the process because there simply isn't enough time in the webinar to talk about every step in these processes. Over to you, Dina.
Thank you, Keith. So I did want to take a quick moment to thank and acknowledge Bob Yates and Keith, your steward leadership in this work. You've provided mentored, reflective, and thoughtful support for this new way of doing and being. So thank you. So with respect to Abbotsford, British Columbia, we have a population of around 150,000 people. Abbotsford is positioned as the hub for the Fraser Valley area. And with increasing housing affordability challenges in Metro Vancouver, we're seeing individuals and families moving east. And so it's pushing these challenges into the valley as well. Abbotsford is experiencing an extremely low rental vacancy rate and increased housing prices. But with all of that, there's deep community roots that are grounded in a robust agricultural sector. We have a municipally owned international airport and aerospace industry, as well as niche manufacturing and a rich Mennonite history as well here in Abbotsford. But Abbotsford is also one of the most multicultural, diverse communities in Canada. On to the next slide, we'll talk a bit about how our need arose. So the first step in our challenge was identifying the need, but that was the impetus was an unfortunate event that occurred in 2014. An outdoor city worker had dumped chicken manure next to a tent of an individual who's experiencing homelessness. So with a response to that, the city struck a multi-stakeholder homelessness task force. And from a series of meetings, they developed recommendations that became the Homelessness in Abbotsford Action Plan that was adopted by City Council in 2014. Two of their first recommendations was one, to strike a council-appointed Homeless Action Advisory Committee comprised of multi-stakeholders and senior levels of government alongside local government, as well as to hire an experienced housing and homelessness coordinator. And that's where I came into the picture. I was hired in April 2015 to oversee the Homelessness Action Plan and housing strategy, as well as a coordinated intake and referral project that was to be co-created with the community in Abbotsford, and that was generously funded by Service Canada through contribution funding. And that's how our work began. Next slide, please. So we knew loud and clear that the stakeholders were tired of talking. They were talked out and they wanted to see action. And so when I first saw the collaborative outcome planning approach, I recognized that this would be an opportunity for us to be able to rebuild trust, deepen relationships and repair relationships. And it would also support us to develop a systems response to respond to homelessness and vulnerability in our community. We started the process by hosting a regional best practice forum in October 2015. We had over 175 multi-stakeholders in attendance. We had invited elected officials from both Fraser Valley and Metro Vancouver to also have a facilitated dialogue. And we introduced the collaborative outcome planning process to the participants through a presentation by Keith and Bob. Through this, we have engaged a broad stakeholder engagement process that continues to this day. Next slide. So what we recognized is the strength of coming together with face-to-face dialogue. And through this, we have struck multi-stakeholder research design teams, focus group dialogue sessions, and a continued approach that we were able to learn from the strategy roadmap process. This has led us to being able to recognize that the city cannot do this work alone, but together we can. And so through aligning activities across sectors, bringing in voice to challenges, we've been able to spark innovation. Next slide, please. The mapping workshops were an experience both of systems planning, but also significant cultural transformation. I know what I observed were people's voices being heard and incorporated in a way that I don't feel they had been acknowledged before. Also, many stakeholders said that it helped them increase their sense of hope to respond to a very challenging, complex situation in our community. Also, as the dialogue went on, it shifted from the gaps of past challenge to the possibilities of prevention and response, and coordination and respectful delivery of services. What one city councillor stated is that she saw the body language shift from the beginning to the first annual community forum. It was cultural transformation in the making. Next slide. So this is an example of just one of the capability areas in our homelessness roadmap for Abbotsford, outreach and wraparound supports. The entire map includes 169 outcomes, 1 long-term goal, 130 actions, 11 capability areas, and 9 impacts. But what's powerful is that when you put all of this together, it is mobilizing a system that multiple stakeholders have been able to author and co-design together. Also, it's created tangible, actionable movement that is accounted for collectively. Next slide, please. So moving to action it is pivoting from collaborative outcome planning to collective action and collective leadership. This is making progress on achieving collective impact, as we have designed a system that has included 3 streams of service delivery. The first stream is prevention and diversion, the second is accommodation and support, and the third is crisis or emergency response. We recognize that we will always have some form of emergency response in our community, or supporting some of the chronic and most vulnerable. However, as we align our activities across these 3 streams of delivery and across our system, we are working towards shifting costs and priorities upstream. Next slide, please. So you'll see on this slide 4 years of amazing collective action. We just hosted our 2019 annual community forum last year. And what I can say is that each year our stakeholders are representative of multiple sectors, all levels of government, faith community, and voices of experience. This has been a rich and robust process. In 2016, we introduced the collaborative map for stakeholders to be able to identify where they lived on the map, where they wanted to contribute to, and where the priorities should be. Since then, this forum process has helped us to report back to our community, to be accountable for the actions that we have completed, to show measures of tangible progress, and for us to be able to inform our work program collectively for the coming year. We, the collective we, not just the city, but all of the stakeholder groups, have shown great investment in this process. As we are enhancing the shelter system, increasing the number of housing units, and integrating health and community integration outcomes throughout our community, we are seeing progress made. Next slide, please. This slide is, I think, an excellent tool and reminder of the ability and benefits of this approach. You do not just receive a community-informed policy document with the collaborative outcome planning approach. You receive a series of interactive tools to guide you through the journey and in a way that supports multiple ways of knowing and doing. For example, the first one is called Logic Model. That supports linear thinkers if a systems map is too challenging to work through at the beginning. However, each one builds upon the other. And I'll show you in a minute how we've also used it as a powerful communication tool. Next slide, please. So with respect to setting priorities, this map reflects the priority areas that were identified by the stakeholders at the first community forum. What is interesting is that these priorities also align with the Homelessness Action Plan priorities. I am pleased to report 4 years later, since 2015, we have met all of the strategic objectives outlined in the Homelessness Action Plan. We've reported back to Council with recommendations for our next reiteration of our Homeless Action Plan. And we also have animated every capability area in the roadmap. We have much more work to do, many more actions to complete, but the setting priorities really do matter. And doing it together makes all the difference to support consistent, sustaining momentum and systems planning and mobilization. Next slide, please. Implementing the collaborative outcome plan as part of the homelessness prevention and response system was key, but also the collaborative outcome planning approach served as the architecture for our systems work. Next slide, please. So with respect, we've had multiple projects and initiatives that are creating and forming the systems work that we're doing. And I also have to acknowledge Service Canada's generous contribution funding towards the development of a coordinated intake and referral model in our community. This truly was the catalyst for our systems work. We were able to share and leverage resources and write additional grants to support not only the development of a coordinated intake and referral model, but the system that was attached to it to respond to vulnerability in our community. We've employed community-based action research and collective impact conditions through this collaborative roadmap process. That is how we have grounded this work in evidence-based practice. The Abbotsford Homelessness Prevention and Response System is a community-owned, community-invested, and community-mobilized system. So not one level of government or organization owns or stewards this system alone. One tangible project example of this is the Abbotsford Community Hub Center. We opened its doors in February of 2019. It is a multi-agency housing, health, and community integration system or center. The only criteria to utilize the services there is that you feel welcomed. And it was an amazing collaborative partnership between Fraser Health, the City of Abbotsford, Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction, University of Fraser Valley, Positive Living Fraser Valley, Marmar Pharmacy, Dr. John Farley, Inasmuch Refugee Society, and Healthy Aging Abbotsford. And we're glad to welcome our newest partner, Embers Staffing Solutions. We are already showing shared client-centered outcomes. People are receiving the support that they need, in streamlined and responsive manners. We're measuring our shared outcomes, and we look forward to reporting out on this a little bit later. Next slide, please. So, establishing and nurturing leadership. We couldn't have done this work without the courageous leadership of our City Council stepping forward and leaning into this challenging circumstance. Through the task force work, it was identified that the city should take the lead as the neutral convener of this work. We recognize that local municipalities do not have the mandate for housing, health, or income assistance, but what we can do is inform local conditions. We can enhance capacity and support shared and leveraged funding through a community infrastructure approach. This is a picture of our Homeless Action Advisory Committee, which acts as our community advisory board. It's a very collaborative approach towards leadership. And what I'm recognizing is it is deepening and sustaining relationships too. Next slide, please. So I cannot signify the importance of data, or it is the tools that are creating the tangible report card back to our stakeholders. It's supporting sustained momentum to work towards shared person-centered outcomes. And it truly is reflective of the shift from singular agency inputs and outputs to shared systems outcomes. Performance measurement is key for continuous improvement and community infrastructure planning. Accountable measures are necessary to maintain focus on shared outcomes, measure rate of change, and identify the synergies of multiple components of an integrated and multifaceted system. It truly is an all-hands-on-deck approach that needs to be accounted for to support a community infrastructure approach to thrive. We are currently focusing efforts to integrate Help Seeker, Abbotsford Community Foundation Vital Signs outcomes, Ministry of Health data with the Abbotsford Homelessness Prevention and Response System shared outcomes. It is the mobilization of a healthy city strategy. Next slide, please. So with respect to ongoing communication, it is integral that we do keep everyone connected and informed. We have an active community of integrated practice, which we look forward to strengthening over this coming year. We also, through our monthly Homeless Action Advisory Committee meetings, facilitate focused topic dialogues that highlight collaborative roadmap capability areas to reinforce the application of the map, as well as to sustain collective momentum and focus on shared outcomes. This process also helps us to identify gaps, needs, patterns, and trends to support City Council to advocate to senior levels of government, and as a system to be adaptable, flexible, and responsive to change and need in the community. We also invite knowledge sharing partners across Canada or wherever to join in some of these focused topic dialogues. So please let me know if this is something you would like to do. Next slide, please. So with respect to inspiring and innovating, this truly is a co-creation approach. As I had mentioned, we have a community of integrated practice. We are increasing the number of housing units, addressing wraparound support needs, and also looking towards attaching our Abbotsford Homelessness Prevention and Response System as the hub to the integrated court that is underway. For more information, please look at our website. You can search it, Abbotsford Housing and Homelessness, and you will see also our Stories project. It is an evolving living project that shows a series of videos about the work that is underway in our community. Next slide, please. So bringing it all together, in reality, we have mobilized our systems approach with limited resources, We have often been so busy doing that we haven't had enough time to communicate out to the broader public about the work that is underway. I want to emphasize to all of you that this is so very important to do, especially when working with complex social issues that take time and a series of tangible and intangible steps to make a difference. In summary, this is just as much about systems planning as it is cultural transformation. Overall, what we have learned in our process is when you build a system that responds to the most vulnerable in your community, you are creating pathways for everyone in community to thrive. And thank you for the opportunity to present today. And thank you, Keith, for supporting us and our community through this process.
Well, that's been my pleasure. Next slide, please. So Dina, you're got a little bit more, we're going to do a little bit of a tango here. So we wanted to share with you some of the reflections and learnings, some of which we've already brought forward, but just to highlight some more important pieces as we look back on the experience over the last 4 years. So next slide, please. These are a bit packed with words, so we're just going to speak them out to you. But we feel these are, as I said, just some important components to be thinking about. So I will make statement then, Dina, and we'll just sequence back and forth. So homelessness is a complex systemic challenge occurring at multiple scales across a diversity of people, interests, and stakeholder organizations.
Well, Keith, I believe an ecosystems model recognizes how different influencers, conditions, and impacts interplay at a personal, community, and societal level. The approach we used explored this complex space and identified and unpacked the factors so they could be aligned, then mobilized in a responsive, person-centered manner.
Dina, to respond to and prevent homelessness, we need to understand and work with one another in a way that reflects its systemic nature and the outcomes we share and aim to achieve.
Understanding the seeing within the system complexity sets place a foundation for resourcing and employing a community infrastructure approach that comprises built and social infrastructure, hard and soft skills, and a new kind of communication between sectors and facets of the community.
So to respond to and prevent homelessness, we need to seek and co-define the system by its shared purpose. In other words, a common goal and common outcomes centered on the needs of people experiencing homelessness and those at risk of becoming homeless.
Yes, and mobilizing, adapting, and sustaining action that is both responsive and reflective requires a deepening of the purpose, challenging value systems at every level, and exposing the interplay of societal norms, power, and positionality. This work is as much about systems transformation as it is about cultural transformation.
Next slide, please. The we needs to be the community in the broadest sense of this word, working together collectively and with a long-term sustaining commitment to these outcomes.
I believe certain foundational principles of transparency, respect, value, safety for individuals to challenge norms, and the will to sustain all help to resource and fund the actions to create change. Often stakeholders require evidence to make outcomes tangible. They need to see benefits of their efforts and community outcomes that deliver impact or meaningful change.
The collective effort comes in different forms that reflect different degrees of relationship between community members, ranging from communication all the way through to interdependent collaboration.
There is a significant need for continuous, targeted capacity building to provide stakeholders the tools required to support effective response or service delivery. These people investments are valued and demonstrate the exceptional and maturing state of our current systems work, a shift from competition over scarce resources to recognizing the power of collaborative abundance.
Next slide, please. The collective effort to achieve collective impact requires a distinctive form of leadership and style of mentoring. Perhaps that could be a topic for another webinar.
Reflecting upon this, Keith, I feel that each complex issue has its own ecosystem that is complete with nodes and nodules that require interrupting, aligning, or determining synergetic combinations that will generate the collective energy required to respond in a different manner. Simply put, lean in and just do it. In addition, resources are required: hard, soft, built, social, shared, and leveraged financial investment, multi-sectoral communication, political, and community will. As I said earlier, our system is a community-owned, invested, and mobilized system. It requires all of these resources to work together to sustain itself. And also, what I recognize as a deep learning in this work is to make space to acknowledge past practices, stay grounded in the reality of the present to mobilize incremental, tangible actions while always staying open to explore and imagine the possibilities. This is how the jigsaw puzzle becomes complete, in a manner that is grounded in the core values or outcomes that are determined, mobilized, and committed to by your community of stakeholders.
Thanks, Dina. Thanks, Lindsay. We appreciate this opportunity.
Great. Thank you so much to our three panelists for joining us. And that concludes the presentation portion of the webinar. And now we're going to shift to a Q&A session. So audience, if you have any questions for either David French, Keith Jones, or Dina K. Benno, now is the time to type them into the questions box, and we will go through them and hopefully get to all of them. While we're waiting for the audience to ask their questions, I'd like to ask a question, and this is for all three panelists. What are one or two key takeaways that you would like the audience to leave with today?
Well, I'll start if you like. In my experience with these kinds of complex challenges, a key piece is understanding and finding your common purpose. Human beings thrive on common purpose, and I think around these complex challenges, it's no different. When we have a common purpose, some amazing things can happen. Finding that common purpose is not always easy, but invariably it comes if you work hard at it and you begin to understand the full dimensions of the challenge you're trying to address. So I think, Lindsay, purpose is what drives a lot of this.
I think one of the key takeaways I would say is never underestimate the value of the pre-work that is required to animate community change and to develop tangible projects. It really is supported by digging deep and looking at what relationships need to be made and how we can align and also support individuals with purposeful work. It's really about creating those circles of support for everyone that is involved in the system. It's truly one of the most important values that I've recognized in the work to date.
For me, you know, I think what resonates for me in this presentation and in your work as a collective is that very rarely did you talk about housing as a solution here, which is, again, what we continue to talk about around the solutions to homelessness aren't just housing. And so the level of complexity in this scenario you've identified really sort of is enlightening in a way that allows us to use it as a template to think about our approach going forward. You know, you've done most of the heavy lifting, and I think the examples you've shared can resonate for lots of communities who are either looking to refine their practice or their delivery, or are brand new to the space around where to start. I think that's the nice thing too about it. It's your work is that you can plug in anywhere you need to.
Great, thank you so much. We do have a question from the audience, and this one is from KH Jarrett. And the question is, what were the processes in which you engaged with the lived experience members of your research?
Oh, thank you. Excellent question. So we engaged individuals with lived experience from the very beginning through our multi-stakeholder research design team process. So as I mentioned earlier, the coordinated intake and referral project that was funded through Service Canada really was the catalyst or impetus of our work. And so we began with focus groups of individuals who were experiencing homelessness. They were active ambassadors at our first regional best practice forum. And now we also have individuals with lived experience as co-researchers through the work that we have done. And they have mobilized a group within Abbotsford through leadership of individuals with lived experience, the business community, City of Abbotsford, and Fraser Health, called the Business Engagement Ambassador Project. And so individuals are in the lived experience community are out engaging with businesses and residents, supporting beautification in the neighborhoods, discard pickup. But more importantly, what we're recognizing is it's reducing stigma and it's creating opportunities for different types of conversations to occur in our community. And it's also helping to inform our systems planning work.
Great, thank you. So it looks like we don't have any more questions from the audience. So either that means that people are processing what they've just heard here today and will come up with questions later, which of course you're welcome to reach out to each of the panelists. Their contact information is listed here. So if you have questions for them after the fact, you're more than welcome to reach out. So it could be that people are processing, or it could be that you did such a great job that there are no questions. So with that in mind, is there anything else that either David, Keith, or Dina that you would like to say as a wrap up?
I wouldn't mind just commenting on David's comment on housing a few minutes ago. It was interesting when we did the work with Abbotsford, we were using the housing first model as a very powerful guide for beginning to think about how we think about this as a system. And that particular way in which it manifested itself in terms of the outcomes that we identified was really at the capability level, the clusters that we showed you one cluster on the wraparound services. But it really manifested itself in terms of prevention, community integration, respectful delivery, the housing capacity itself, which was the largest of the areas in the map, and then outreach and wraparound services and intake and referral. So those were the sort of ways in which the design team interpreted the intentions of housing first within the context of of Abbotsford.
Yeah.
And I think from a practitioner level, my portfolio includes both affordable housing and homelessness. So housing is a primary foundational element that we're working through because we know we lack housing across the spectrum in our community. But what it really helped to highlight is that alongside housing, we need to mindfully and intentionally think about all of the synergies and the pathways to health, to community integration, and how aligning all of that and working through that at the same time really matters. You can't focus on one without the other. It's moved us out of our silos and really has sparked that innovation piece that's required to sustain momentum and hopefully make significant gain for many of our vulnerable individuals in the community. That's really truly what it's about at the end of the day.
I have a question. Can I do that?
Absolutely.
So I'm really interested in how you've, to my points earlier in the presentation, how you've shared this with your provincial government around some of the successes and perhaps templates going forward. I know that BC has made a commitment to a homelessness action plan, and that continues to be work underway. But yeah, I'm interested in how you've shared that from a government relations perspective.
Oh, that's a great question. So I think we've done it multiple ways. Again, it's like taking a look at that ecosystems approach. So on our Homeless Action Advisory Committee that meets monthly, we have both BC Housing and Fraser Health representatives. Also, we have Ministry of Social Development, Poverty Reduction. We have BC Community Corrections as well. These are kind of prime provincial statutory agency partners that are actively engaged and participating in our research design teams. So they're receiving that information and helping to inform us at the same time around provincial requirements. The Hub Center project that I had mentioned has actually been nominated for a provincial innovation award. And so we're getting the word out about our systems in multiple ways. But I think one significant tangible way through shared outcome measurement, because we have mobilized a community infrastructure approach. We recognized when we were effective in advocating for increased funding into our shelter system. So we were able to activate more beds through a temporary winter shelter system for youth and young adults, older adults and women, as well as extreme weather sites in our year-round shelters. Because we integrated that with our health services for vulnerable individuals, we have measured reduction in emergency department presentations, reduced hospitalization utilization rates, reduced opioid rate, overdose rates, and we were able to stabilize and house people at a huge positive rate of change in our community because we were able to activate and mobilize that system as a coordinated approach. Yeah. And so that speaks volumes to the province when you can articulate the cost savings to systems.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you.
Great, thanks for asking that question, David. And in the last couple of minutes, we've had a few audience questions come up as well. So for the rest of the audience, we have about 20 minutes left in our session. So if you have a question, you just hit the arrow in the top right corner and the control panel will pop up and you can ask your question that way. But in the meantime, we have a question from Al Clune. It's a two-parter actually. So the first question was, what was the key catalyst for getting the Abbotsford project off the ground? And the second part of the question is, how do you engage politicians who don't think there's a problem?
Great question.
So I'll take the first question. So I think there were a series of events, both positive and maybe not so positive, that were the catalyst to the Abbotsford work. As I mentioned, there was an unfortunate event around that outdoor worker making the decision that he did, and that did spark a BC Supreme Court case where the city did have to respond to that. However, the positive outcome of that was that everyone came together in a new way, and they recognized that they really had to approach this challenge with tools that they may have not utilized in the past. And so I think that was the impetus or the catalyst, but also recognizing we couldn't have done this without resources. So the Service Canada contribution towards the coordinated intake and referral really helped to provide the fuel. So we were able to bring folks in like Keith and Bob to support us with the collaborative mapping and to be able to fund opportunities and spaces for our stakeholders to come together.
Do you want me to take the next question?
Sure, David.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question because I think from a policy perspective and for a movement perspective, I think we're it's really important for us to keep our MLAs engaged in moving this needle along. And so whether or not it's your question comes from how do you get an MLA to be engaged in local efforts, or how do you then get an MLA to be engaged in provincial efforts, I think it's the same thing. You know, sometimes what happens in this sector, and I saw it as a bureaucrat, I saw that there wasn't sort of often space for community organizations or leaders at the community level to share successes and share successes beyond outcomes reporting or nominal roles reporting. And so I think that's an opportunity first to sort of set some landscape and set some context for MLAs, is teach up, consider your role. Unfortunately, not only as individuals who are saving lives and changing the trajectory of individuals, but you also need to think of your role as a teacher and allowing MLAs to learn along with you with respect to the innovations, but also the gaps that exist. You know, I carried a role in the provincial government of Alberta for a number of years where I worked hand in hand with an MLA to identify gaps across systems, mostly for young people. But what was clear was that they were wanting to learn and they were there to listen. And you know, I learned early on in a career as a bureaucrat that if government isn't listening to community, they aren't doing their job. And so I think use that as an opportunity to share and inform and teach, and when possible, tour and partner if you can. You know, we need to look at our government partners as friends and allies in this work and invite them in versus call them out.
Mhm.
I'd like to add to that too. I think, David, all of which was, I think, very appropriate. I wrote down very quickly when I heard the question, I put how to engage them. I said thoughtfully, strategically.
Yeah.
And I put down educate, which I don't like that word. I think learn is far better, but do so in a strategic manner. I think help work with them to help build the case. So in the work we do, in the map for Abbotsford on the right-hand side are all of the benefits or impacts. And you know, you only need to pick one or two where that politician might say, "Oh, that's a very high value impact."
Yeah.
So they will see the value and try and find out through conversation which of those are particularly of importance to that person. The other notes I just made was if you were undertaking a dialogue in advance of developing the plan, make sure they're included in that conversation. Like invite them as a participant, and maybe not only one, but you know, several, and then include them in the design team as well. We had at least one in the design team. They were also in the community forum. There was 3 or 4. The mayor was involved and has been involved quite integrally for quite a bit of the process and very supportive. I think keeping them informed, obviously. And when you think about these large charts that we build, they are in themselves a narrative. And that narrative, they need to help them see themselves in that narrative. And if they're part of the design team, then encourage them to identify outcomes that may in fact have a much stronger role for the political level to be engaged. Because sometimes they're seeking a way to actually, how can I help? And so build their role explicitly into the delineation of the outcomes and the interventions.
That's great advice. Yeah.
And thank you all for your insightful responses. We have another question from S. Howard, and this is another 2-parter. So part 1, are there any findings related to the potentially critical impact of culturally based programming and approaches for Indigenous peoples? Actually, let's just do that one. We'll do that one question first, and then we'll go to the part 2.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? It broke up on my end, right in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely. So are there any findings related to the potentially critical impact of culturally based programming and approaches for Indigenous peoples?
I'll maybe start, Dina and Keith, and you guys can plug in.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's important to language is important, so I think findings, I'm not familiar with true findings of specific and targeted responses for Indigenous peoples. We can cite a number of examples, and I think that have painted a picture and illustrate the importance of why we need to be engaging and working with the Indigenous populations differently. And certainly we can fill your inbox with a number of those kinds of examples. As far as findings, I'm drawing a bit of a blank at the moment.
And just to add more context to that question, in the context of this particular project in the city of Abbotsford, I think was what S. Howard was
Oh, okay.
asking about. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the question. So I think what I can ground it in is the collaborative roadmap process. It does really support multiple ways of knowing and doing and being. And so I think with that, it really has helped to support culturally diverse perspectives to also be captured within the collective approach that we're implementing. There's much more work to do now that we have a national Indigenous housing strategy. So the national strategy came after we developed this collaborative roadmap. So that is one of the recommended objectives as we move forward with the next reiteration of the Homelessness Action Plan, is putting an Indigenous lens on that. But meanwhile, we have been reaching out and building and deepening relationships with our First Nations communities and partners. And so we look forward to the evolution of this work. So I think when you talk about findings at this point, it's really about building those relationships in a respectful manner and learning from all of our community partners and creating space for diversity that is respectful and intentional.
Lindsay, I'm just thinking in terms of, we added a couple of slides there at the back end, just in the event something came up, and I'm thinking there's a couple there that might be useful, probably the first two. Are you able to move to those slides?
Sure thing. So this one here?
Yeah, when I mentioned, I'm using this more to illustrate a narrative that is embedded in this case, the collaborative roadmap that Abbotsford has. This one is a narrative of a person that was experiencing homelessness and their journey that they took to become a healthier person. The narrative is in the bottom right, and the specific interpretation of the narrative in terms of what particular interventions and actions and outcomes were affected were then translated from that. But the reason I'm showing it was to also come and talk about the political folks and helping them understand where they were in the narrative. So that was one thing. This is one way to sort of start to unfold that. The next slide. I also just want to mention, with some of the work we're doing now, this one comes from the Literacy Project in Victoria. We have put now, in order to address specific target populations, which could be, or circumstances, then we indicate that the chart, the maps that we produce are a framework, and they can then be tailored to a particular population. So that's why I've included this one. So if you want to put a youth lens or a seniors lens or whatever lens you want to put on the particular set of outcomes, that's possible to do. And sometimes that will involve language changes as well, in terms of the way in which you convey that particular outcome, excuse me, or the action. Thank you, Lindsay.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Keith, Dina, and David for your responses. So part two of the question from S. Howard is about the range of outcomes and indicators and qualitative and quantitative measures. So hold on, I'll read it again. What range of outcomes and indicators and qualitative and quantitative measures are captured and examined in order to show real impact in terms that are meaningful to both funders and users of shelters?
Well, I could start with that. And Lindsay, I'm wondering if you could flip to our systems slide, because that's illustrative of how we've developed our key indicators and measured outcomes.
Yeah, sure. So just bear with me while I flip through a couple, and Dina, if you want to just let me know which slide we're looking
So
for.
it's actually the additional slides that you uploaded. So it's just that graph systems graphic. It might be up. There we go.
Okay, yeah.
So our system, each component, it's broken into thirds. So the first third of the system is the general population can be referred into the system for support to or access to housing or health, income assistance, community integration supports. But each component of this system has been developed with its own set of shared outcomes and key performance indicators. And the way we did that is through, again, our multi-stakeholder research design teams. So it was a collective informed approach on what was important and integral to measure in for each component of the system. But we didn't want to measure in isolation of the overall system. So that's where the collaborative roadmap work. We have identified shared outcomes and performance indicators systems wide. So each component of our system, whether it be our interagency care team that is comprised of both Fraser Health and City Resources, or the hub center, or even our housing or shelter system, for example, all of that is tied into, as Keith had mentioned, the right-hand side of the map, where we're actually measuring impacts like reduction in emergency room visits or reduced costs to savings, or cost savings that can be reinvested into the community. So that's really our focus around how not only, so primarily how we're supporting incremental steps towards wellness in individuals' lives, but also recognizing the cumulative outcome as a community wellness outcome as well.
And maybe I could just add, Dina, that we, with some of the work we've done with you, we have developed, at least at a second stage now, the performance measurement framework to support the work we've done so far. And that is a mix of both quantitative and qualitative measures. The more you tend to go downstream in terms of the outcomes and impacts, the more you're needing to rely on qualitative measures. But that doesn't always mean that they're less meaningful. It's just that it's a different approach to collecting that kind of information.
Excellent, thank you. So we've got 3 minutes left. I'm gonna say that wraps up our Q&A section. Actually, we've got one more question and maybe we can answer it. Dina, you mentioned positive outcomes in terms of health. For example, decreased emergency room utilization. Can you share quickly some insights into how your collaboration was able to share data across agencies while maintaining privacy and confidentiality?
Oh, thank you for that question. That's a critical piece of our coordinated intake and referral project. As we established our research design team and identified who clearly needed to be a part of this collective responsive system, we developed a memorandum of understanding. Linda Brummett is one of my colleagues at City Hall who supported and facilitated this process. We had 7 key community agencies sign on to the Memorandum of Understanding, and also the statutory agency partners, such as Ministry of Social Development and Fraser Health and BC Housing. So that, and we work closely with community corrections as well. So we're able to share that flow of information back and forth, but it's also at different levels of the system. So for example, the interagency care team will have access to that personal data. They are also the relationship keeper for some of the individuals who are unattached to agencies. But if an individual has a trusting relationship with an agency partner, for example, then they are maintained as their relationship keeper. And so that the information is held with integrity for that person. But with respect to the systems work, then really all I see is the aggregate level data. So that's how we're able to kind of share information at the levels where it makes the most sense.
Excellent, thank you. So thank you so much to the audience for your great questions, and thanks again to our panelists for joining us here today, David French, Keith Jones, and Dina K. Benno. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.